The Roman Empire is not merely fading, it is cracking. Across the vast, snow-dusted expanse of what was once the iron-bound province of Gaul, a terrifying new reality is taking hold. This is the moment a fearsome people, with their red hair, terrifying moustaches, and weapons of war, stepped from the shadows. They did not look like the heirs of civilization, yet they would claim the inheritance of the Caesars. Who were these brutal, tight-trousered warlords they called the Franks? Their appearance was designed to shock. Immense forms topped with red hair, shaved on the back of the skull, with fierce combed moustaches, clad in tight leggings that made a mockery of Roman dignity. They were a loose, war-hungry confederation of tribes, drawn together by a shared instinct for plunder and a talent for brutal, effective warfare. Their raids were a constant bleeding wound on the proud body of the empire. This threat came to a head in the mid-4th century. The empire, still reeling from decades of civil conflict, needed stability. The general tasked with stabilizing the frontier was Julian, the brilliant but controversial cousin of the emperor, and the last Roman leader to worship the old gods. Julian had just won a crushing victory against the Greater Alemanni Confederation near Strasbourg, but to the north, a small, stubborn force of Franks refused to scatter. This was no grand army, but a force of around 600 Frankish warriors. They had seized abandoned Roman fortresses along the River Meuse Valley, using the old stone as a staging point for relentless pillaging. Julian knew that to secure the peace, he could not leave this serpent at the gate. He advanced, laying siege to the small band, even as the harsh campaigning season drew to a close and the first heavy snows began to fall. The danger was immense. The historian recorded the general's anxiety. The River Rhine was threatening to freeze solid. If the ice hardened, the 600 savages could simply march across the river in a moonless night and disappear back into the forests, only to return with the spring. Julian's response was a testament to his military genius and his grim determination. He ordered his soldiers to row up and down the river all night, every night, from sunset to dawn. Their tireless work, the constant motion of their scouting vessels, was enough to break up the forming ice, denying the barbarians any chance of escape. The siege was effective. Trapped by the winter, unable to flee or resupply, the Franks were finally forced to surrender. A Roman general would have been expected to put them to the sword, extinguishing the threat in a brutal display of imperial power. But Julian did something that would irrevocably change the course of European history. He did not execute them. Instead, he made a political and military calculation of breathtaking cynicism. He settled them along the northernmost line of the empire, near the mouth of the Rhine. He did the same when other Frankish warbands intruded the following summer. They were settled as foederati, allies of the Roman people, granted land in exchange for military service. This was not a moment of weakness. It was a pragmatic transaction. Rome was suffering from a massive manpower shortage. It needed the fiercest, most effective soldiers to man its lines, and the Franks, with their tight pants and deadly throwing axes, were certainly that. By granting them land, the empire brought the wolf inside the walls, domesticating it just enough to use its teeth. This process had been underway for centuries. An earlier inscription from the late 3rd century already spoke of this dual identity. I belong to the Frankish nation, but as a soldier under arms, I am a Roman. Their warlords were already becoming sophisticated, speaking Latin and reading the classic poets. They had access to Roman wine, Roman central heating, and Roman gold. But for the vast military and political engine of the empire, they provided the raw muscle needed to defend the collapsing frontier. This strategic compromise held. But this deal came with a terrible, hidden clause. The Franks were loyal, but only until the day came when the empire itself was no longer worth defending. If you want to dive deeper into the pivotal, world-changing battles and decisions that define our history, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring these epic stories to life. The Romans had, in a strange way, invented these people. By imposing their own military standards and the need for large, unified entities, the empire had molded fragmented tribes into larger, more cohesive confederations like the Franks and the even larger Alemanni. The Germanic peoples began to measure themselves against Roman standards, paradoxically making them far more menacing. For the Roman military stationed along the Rhine, this arrangement created a profound identity crisis. The army, once the agent of Romanization for the frontier regions, was increasingly dominated by barbarian officers and soldiers. The Roman system was slowly becoming barbarianized from the inside out. Yet for decades, this compromise held. The Franks were fiercely loyal to the emperors who paid them. By the end of the 4th century, they were even willing to fight other Franks who lay beyond the frontier, defending the very civilization that had once hunted them. Their loyalties were complex. They were Frankish warlords who drew their authority from their martial reputation, but they were also highly cultured Romans who relied on the emperor's coin and prestige. This was the strange, unstable world the Franks inhabited, a bridge between two identities. But the stability was fragile, dependent entirely on the integrity of the empire itself. In the chaos of the early 5th century, that fragile integrity finally shattered. In 406, vast groups of barbarians, Suebi, Vandals, and Alans, crossed the Rhine, forcing the empire to turn in on itself. 4 years later, the Visigoths sacked Rome itself. The great catastrophe had arrived, and the Frankish foederati were forced to choose. With Roman military and political institutions collapsing, the men with the weapons and the know-how suddenly held all the power. They were no longer the empire's hired help, they were the new kingmakers. But the transformation gripping Gaul was not just military, it was spiritual. While the Frankish warlords were maneuvering to claim the land, a quieter, more profound revolution had already begun, embodied by a man who rejected the very standards the empire had stood for. The future of Gaul was not to be decided by a general in a legion, but by a peasant soldier serving a different kind of king. This was the story of Martin. Like the early Franks, he came from the military, serving in the Roman army under Julian the Apostate. He was from humble lineage, stationed in the very region where the Franks were being settled. And one cold winter, his life took a turn that would change the spiritual history of the West. The bitter cold of the year was extreme. By the gateway of the city, a ragged beggar shivered, ignored by his warm, hurried fellow townsmen. Then came Martin, dressed for duty. He had no money, only his arms and his heavy military cloak. In a famous, legendary act of Christian compassion, he drew his sword and cut the cloak in two, giving one half to the beggar. That night, Martin had a dream. He saw Christ, clad in the very portion of the cloak he had given away. The Lord spoke, "Whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me." This was not just charity, it was a revelation. Martin, convinced, resigned from the army. He refused the final military bonus offered by Julian, telling the emperor, "Until now it is you I have served from this moment on. I am a servant of Christ." The irony was seismic. Julian, devoted to the old gods, represented the past. Martin, the humble Christian, embodied the future. This Martin was not just a Christian, but one of a peculiarly radical kind. The new Christian elite often retained their aristocratic wealth and contempt for the poor, simply swapping the title of consul for bishop. They saw the church as another means of self-advancement. Martin, however, completely rejected the notion that one could be both Christian and rich. An aristocratic admirer described him as having the looks of a peasant, with shoddy clothes and hair that was a disgrace. His ambition was to become a monachos, one who lives alone, a monk. He became one of the first monks in the Western Empire, settling on a grassy plain near the city of Tours. He subjected himself to incredible austerity, enduring extremes of heat and cold, subsisting on little. But this austere life became a source of powerful admiration. It was precisely his dramatic rejection of worldly standards that won him the loyalty of the common folk, and even some elites. Yet, this despised peasant held a source of power that neither emperors nor bishops could control. He possessed heavenly authority, and soon a barbarian king would realize that Martin's power was the key to conquering Gaul. He began to perform spectacular miracles, healing the sick, straightening twisted limbs, and giving sight to the blind. His fame grew so intense that in 371 he was elected Bishop of Tours. It was a shocking event, as bishops were almost always drawn from the highest social classes. Martin, who ran away and hid in a barn, only to be given away by the honking of geese, was finally forced to accept the position. His power did not derive from Roman law or class standing, but directly from heaven. His person was charged with an incredible, uncanny energy. In Christian opinion, even his body, his relics, would continue to be a source of power after his death. When he died, two groups, one from Tours and one from the neighboring city of Poitiers, came to claim the body. The people of Poitiers blocked the entrance to his cell. They all fell asleep. The people of Tours, who had stayed awake, snuck through the window, grabbed the body, and took it in triumph. The relics of Martin remained in Tours, an unstoppable wellspring of power that stood outside the control of the snobbish Gallo-Roman elite. He was an embarrassment to them, a bum of a bishop. But a new people, soon to emerge as the masters of Gaul, would recognize in Martin exactly what they needed: a celestial patron despised by the old masters, but perfectly suited to their new barbarian dominion. In the political vacuum of the late 5th century, the Frankish warlords were determined to claim their inheritance. They were no longer content to be mere federati. When the institutions of Rome broke down, power passed to those with weapons and the audacity to use them. These ambitious new leaders needed two things: legitimacy and a terrifying, unassailable origin story. This desire led to the birth of a legend so outrageous, so bizarre, that it could only have been invented to justify absolute sudden power. It was the legend of the Merovingian line. This was the dynasty of the first Frankish kings, and according to their own history, they took their name from a king called Merovech, whose mother had gone for a swim in the ocean. There, she encountered a mysterious sea creature that was part bull, part human, and part sea monster. This creature, whose precise form defies all known biology, was said to have fathered Merovech. The story, whatever its improbable origins, became the foundation of the royal dynasty. Why would the Franks invent such a tale? Because they were looking for a source to manifest their greatness that was far beyond the reach of Roman precedent. To be descended from a bull, a man, and a sea monster was a genius way to claim a dynasty that was somehow out of the ordinary, sacred, and ancient. This was the strange, desperate currency of the new Dark Age kings. But the most fearsome of these self-proclaimed monarchs, Childeric's son, would soon take this bizarre inheritance and use it to murder the last living remnant of Rome. The first Frankish leader we know for certain, crowned himself. King was Childeric, who died in 481. His life was a clear example of the fusion of identities. He was a Roman commander of Frankish allies, but he took on the symbols of royalty. Among the Franks, the definitive symbol of royal blood was the length of one's hair. The Merovingian kings became known as the Reges Criniti, the long-haired kings. Their hair was a physical manifestation of their sacred authority. In 1653, his tomb was found near Tournai, Belgium. The grave was sumptuous, containing a cloak decorated with hundreds of golden bees, symbols that Napoleon would later adopt for his own French Empire. On a ring found within the grave was the inscription, Childericsi Regis, I belong to Childeric the King. The claim was absolute. Childeric was succeeded by his son, a figure of tremendous strategic cunning and ruthlessness, Clovis. Clovis was only one of many warlords, Visigoths, Burgundians, and Alemanni, scrapping over the corpse of Roman Gaul. But he was determined to be the sole master. His most immediate rival was a man named Syagrius, who called himself Rex Romanorum, King of the Romans, and ruled a territory with its capital in the city that would eventually be called Paris. The confrontation came in 486 at the Battle of Soissons. Clovis won a crushing victory, defeating Syagrius and seizing his kingdom. Syagrius fled south, only to be returned to Clovis by the Visigothic king. Clovis imprisoned the last king of the Romans, and then had him secretly murdered. With Syagrius gone, there was no longer anyone claiming to rule Gaul in a Roman way. This victory marked the end of an era. Paris became Clovis's own base, and he set his sights south, determined to conquer all of Gaul. But to advance, he had to confront a power more ancient and enduring than the Roman Empire itself: Christianity. If you're finding this deep dive into the making of Western civilization fascinating, do us a favor and comment below to tell us which historical era you think deserves this cinematic treatment next. Clovis's enemies in the south, the Visigoths and Burgundians, had already embraced Christianity, but they adhered to a form of the faith known as Arianism. This belief held that God the Son, Christ, was subordinate to God the Father. This heresy was not just a theological disagreement, it was a political barrier. It allowed the barbarian kings to integrate into Christian civilization while remaining separate and, in their eyes, superior to the Gallo-Roman population, who overwhelmingly followed the Nicene or Orthodox Catholic form of Christianity. Clovis, unlike them, still worshipped the traditional Roman and Germanic gods, but he was a pragmatist. He knew that to rule the wealthy south of Gaul, he would need to make an accommodation with the Christian elites. He had already married a Burgundian princess named Clotilda, who was an Orthodox Christian. The decisive moment came during his war against the formidable Alemanni. In a fierce, terrifying battle at Tolbiac in the Rhineland, Clovis's forces were on the brink of complete annihilation. It was the moment of desperation, the moment of impossible odds that defined the story of Belgrade, and it defined the story of the Franks. According to tradition, Clovis, seeing his army falter, looked up to heaven and made a desperate battlefield bargain. He made a vow to the Christian God: "If you allow me to win this battle, I will turn to you. I will convert." He won. The victory was immediate, turning the tide of the battle and crushing the Alemanni. Clovis was true to his vow. His conversion, which took place on Christmas Day, was a seismic event. The holy bishop Remigius baptized Clovis and an astonishing 3,000 of his followers. The ceremony was described in glorious political language by the chronicler Gregory of Tours. Clovis, he wrote, stepped forward, like some new Constantine, to wash away the sores of his old leprosy and to be cleansed in flowing water from the sordid stains which he had borne so long. This was not just an act of piety, it was the political masterstroke of the age. By choosing the Orthodox faith, Clovis instantly secured the loyalty of the powerful Gallo-Roman aristocracy, who were the local leaders in all the cities of Gaul. He was immediately welcomed into the fabric of Christian civilization, placing him in direct opposition to his Arian rivals. The final piece of his legitimacy came in 508, after his victories were complete. The Eastern Roman Emperor in Constantinople, Anastasius, sent emissaries to Clovis, honoring him and recognizing him as a consul of the Roman people. Crucially, this official recognition was granted only because Clovis had embraced the Orthodox faith. The barbarian king, the descendant of a mythical sea creature, was now an official representative of the new Rome. He was not just a king, he was a Roman Augustus, a governor, and a divinely chosen champion. His kingdom, born of violence and opportunism, was now blessed by both the church and the empire. Clovis was ready for his final defining act of conquest. With legitimacy secured by gold, steel, and divine favor, Clovis marched south as the champion of orthodoxy. His target was the massive Arian Visigothic kingdom that dominated southern Gaul. He sought to expel the heretics and claim all of Gaul for himself. The final, decisive campaign culminated in the Battle of Vouillé in 507 near the shrine of Saint Martin. Clovis's Frankish Roman army utterly shattered the Visigoths, killing their king and reducing their territory to a tiny, easily managed strip of coastline. The Franks, once the low-rent tribe, had now emerged as the absolute masters of the most prosperous province in the entire Western Empire. But the final, most brilliant act of political theatre was reserved for the Sacred Heart of Gaul, the shrine of Saint Martin in Tours. After his victory, Clovis journeyed there. The scene was utterly transformed. The tomb of the peasant soldier was now surrounded by a glittering complex of churches, towers, and gilded domes. Clovis went into the shrine and emerged clad in the purple tunic and cloak of a Roman general, crowning himself with a diadem. He then rode through the streets of Tours, scattering gold and silver coins to the roaring crowds. This was the moment of ultimate fusion. Clovis was a barbarian warlord whose authority was rooted in his magical long-haired line. He was a Roman consul whose legitimacy was recognized by the emperor. And he was the Christian champion whose power was sanctified by the greatest miracle worker in the West. The two worlds had merged. But Clovis was also a ruthless autocrat. The final years of his life were spent eliminating any potential rival. He convened an assembly of his subjects and spoke mournfully of his destroyed relatives, all the other Frankish chieftains he had murdered, lamenting that he lived among strangers like some solitary pilgrim. The chronicler Gregory of Tours dryly noted that Clovis said this not because he grieved, but because in his cunning way he hoped to find some relative still in the land of the living whom he could kill. Ruthlessness was the price of a unified kingdom. When he died in 511, Clovis was the first Frankish king to be buried in Paris. He had established the most formidable successor kingdom in the Western Empire, and his Merovingian dynasty would rule both as the sacred long-haired descendants of a sea monster and as the legitimate successors of a Roman Augustus. If you enjoyed this journey into the dark age of Europe, share this script with a friend who loves history. Let them know how a mob of terrifying barbarians became the founders of France. The ultimate symbol of their fused power was the very object that began this spiritual transformation, the half-cloak of St. Martin. The piece of fabric the soldier had cut for a beggar became the great war totem of the Merovingian kings. It was carried with the king into battle, a portable, physical testament to divine favor and power. This cloak was called the capella in Latin. A special class of priests was appointed to look after it. These priests were called the capellani. This is where we find the deepest echo of Clovis's great work. The sacred relic of a humble soldier became the enduring heart of a barbarian kingdom. The word for that holy cloth, the capella, is the root of the word we use today for a small place of worship, chapel, and the word for the priests who guarded it, the capellani, is the root of the word chaplain. The rise of the Franks is the story of how a veteran general, a zealous priest, and an army of the faithful clashed with an empire and changed the course of history. It proves that the great hinge moments of history are not always made by the largest armies, but sometimes by the biggest ideas, ensuring that the legacy of a soldier's simple generosity still echoes in every church bell and every sanctuary on earth. This incredible transformation, the fusion of the barbarian, the Roman, and the Christian, typified the emergence of the Frankish kingdom and birthed what would become medieval Europe. It is a story of mad names and mad ambition, but above all, it is the story of how the very language we use was forged in the fire of these Dark Age warlords. The legacy of Clovis, St. Martin, and the long-haired kings is an ongoing conversation. We'll be back on Thursday to explore the next chapter in this incredible dynasty, the warrior queens of the Franks and their mad, blood-soaked rivalries. Until then, make sure to subscribe for more stories, and don't forget to tell us in the comments what piece of history you think deserves to be told next.